39 seconds. That's all the time there was between them. Two earthquakes, both strong enough to level buildings, both striking the same stretch of northern Venezuela on the night of June 24, 2026. The first was a magnitude 7.2. People were still on their feet, still running for doorways, still trying to understand what was happening. And then, 39 seconds later, the ground hit them again. A magnitude 7.5, harder, closer, right under the same coastline. Two giant earthquakes, less than a minute apart. Scientists have a name for this. They call it a doublet, and it is rare enough that most seismologists go an entire career without studying a fresh one on a populated coast. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what a doublet quake is, why this particular fault tore twice in under a minute, and why a warning siren went off more than 500 miles away, on American soil, for 3.2 million United States citizens who had nothing to do with Venezuela at all. You'll understand the threat almost no one in the news is talking about. It isn't the shaking, it's what's sitting on the ground right above the rupture. And you'll understand why the version of this story going viral online, the one about secret weapons and the sun, is not just wrong, it's hiding something far more unsettling than any conspiracy. This is the Horizon Lab, where we take the headline that's meant to scare you and we show you the real science underneath it. Because the truth is almost always stranger than the fear. Let's get into it. If you're new here, this is the channel that reads the data so you don't have to trust a rumor. We pull from the United States Geological Survey, from the tsunami warning centers, from the people whose actual job is to watch these faults. So before we go any further, do me one small favor. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because when the ground moves somewhere in the world, we break down what it means within hours, not days. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how many of you are sitting on a fault line right now and don't even think about it. Because here's the thing about that night in Venezuela. The people living above the El Pilar fault didn't think about it either, until it spoke twice. Let me say that number again, because it matters. 39 seconds. That's shorter than this sentence took to read. In that window, a fault released the energy of the first quake, and then a second patch of the same fault system let go right behind it. Most people who felt it couldn't tell you there were two. To them, it was one long, rolling nightmare that would not stop. The seismographs knew better. The instruments saw two distinct ruptures, two separate releases of strain, stacked back to back like a drummer hitting the same note twice. And the question that every scientist watching those instruments asked in that moment is the same question we're going to answer tonight. Did the first quake cause the second, or were they always going to happen on their own schedule and we just happened to be watching when the fault decided to clear its throat? Hold on to that question. We're going to come back to it at the very end, and the answer is going to change how you think about every earthquake you've ever felt. But first, we have to go back to that coastline. We have to understand what actually broke. And we have to start with the numbers, because the numbers are where the fear becomes real. Here is what the United States Geological Survey recorded, and these are not estimates. These are measured values, logged within minutes by seismometers around the planet. The main shock hit at 5 minutes past 10 in the evening, Venezuela time, magnitude 7.5. The epicenter sat about 14 miles southeast of a town called Umare, on the northern coast, not far from the cities of Valencia and Maracay, and within reach of the capital, Caracas. And the depth is the first detail that should make you sit up. This quake was shallow, only about 6 miles below the surface. Why does that matter? Because depth is everything in an earthquake. A magnitude 7 that happens 100 miles down, deep in the earth, can be almost harmless at the surface. All that rock above it soaks up the energy like a mattress. But a magnitude 7.5 that ruptures just 6 miles down has almost nothing between it and the cities on top of it. The energy comes up fast, and it comes up hard. It hits the buildings before it has any chance to fade. And right before it, 39 seconds before it, came the other one, magnitude 7.2. The USGS initially logged it slightly lower and then revised it upward as the data came in, which is normal. Early numbers move, final numbers settle. By the time the dust cleared on the analysis, they had two events in the low to mid sevens, side by side, on the same fault system in under a minute. Now let me translate magnitude into something you can feel, because the scale fools people. The magnitude scale isn't linear, it's logarithmic. Every whole number is about 32 times more energy released than the number below it. So a magnitude 7.5 is not a little bigger than a 7.2. It releases roughly 2 to 3 times the energy. And both of these were monsters. The USGS issued what's called a pager alert for this event. Pager estimates the human impact, the shaking, the likely damage before the casualty reports even come in. And for this quake, pager went red. Red is the highest level. Red means significant casualties and significant damage are likely, that this is a disaster requiring a national or international response. The instruments were telling emergency managers, before a single phone call came in, that this one was bad. The shaking intensity tells the same story. The USGS shake map, which models how violently the ground moved at each location, registered a maximum intensity of 8.7. On the scale they use, that's in the range they literally label violent. At that level, the ground acceleration reached around 68% of the force of gravity. Think about that. For a moment, in the worst hit zone, the Earth was throwing objects sideways with nearly the force that holds them down. Furniture doesn't slide at that level. It launches. In Caracas, more than 200 miles from the epicenter, buildings swayed hard enough that residents ran into the streets in the dark. Reports of collapsed and damaged structures came in through the night. And I want to be careful and honest with you here, the way this channel always tries to be. As we record this, the official casualty figures from Venezuela's civil protection authorities have not been finalized, so we are not going to throw a confirmed number at you that we can't stand behind. What we do have is a USGS forecasting model called Pager, and I want to be precise about what it is. It is not a body count, it's a probability estimate, generated automatically in the first minutes to help rescue teams gauge the scale. And that model put the odds at roughly a 44% chance that the eventual toll lands somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000 people. Let me be clear, because this is exactly where other channels lie to you. That is not a number of confirmed deaths. It is a range of what's possible, based on the shaking and the buildings in the way. The real figure may end up far lower. We'll update it when the authorities count. But the model going that high tells you what the instruments feared. So that's the what. 2 shocks, 39 seconds apart, shallow, violent, red alert. Now comes the part that actually explains it. Because to understand why this fault broke twice, you have to understand what kind of fault it is. And it's the same kind that runs right through California. Most people, when they picture an earthquake, imagine the ground dropping. One side falls, the other stays, and everything caves in. That's one kind of fault. But it's not this one. The fault that broke under Venezuela does something different, and once you see it, you'll never picture earthquakes the same way again. It's called a strike-slip fault, and instead of one side dropping, the 2 sides slide past each other, horizontally, like 2 cars scraping side by side on a highway. The specific system here is called the Pilar fault, part of the larger boundary between 2 of the planet's great tectonic plates. To the south, the South American plate, to the north, the Caribbean plate. And these 2 plates are not crashing head-on, they're grinding past each other, sideways, at a rate of about 3/4 of an inch per year. That doesn't sound like much, 3/4 of an inch. You could cover it with your thumb, but here's the trap. The plates want to move that distance every single year. The problem is, the rock along the fault is locked. It's stuck. Friction holds the 2 sides in place while the deeper plates keep pushing, so the rock doesn't slide smoothly. It bends. It stores the strain. Year after year, decade after decade, it loads up like a spring being wound tighter and tighter. And then one day the friction loses. The rock can't hold anymore, and all that stored energy, all those decades of slow, invisible bending, releases in a few violent seconds. The 2 sides lurch past each other, sometimes by several feet all at once, and that lurch is the earthquake. Let me give you the analogy I always come back to, because it makes the whole thing click. Take a wooden ruler and press both ends against your desk, then slowly push the ends toward each other. The ruler bends. It bows upward, storing the force of your hands. You can feel the tension building, and then, past a certain point, it snaps straight with a crack and jumps. That snap is the earthquake. The bending is the 100 years of quiet before it. The fault was bending under Venezuela for a very long time. On June 24th, it snapped. Now, why does this matter for the doublet, for the 2 quakes in 39 seconds? Because a strike-slip fault isn't a single clean line. It's a system. It's a whole network of cracks and segments, some of them side by side, some of them overlapping, all of them under the same enormous strain. And when one segment lets go, it doesn't just release its own energy, it shoves its neighbor. It changes the stress on the rock right next to it, instantly. Sometimes that shove is enough to push an already loaded segment over the edge. That's one of the leading explanations for what happened here. The first rupture, the magnitude 7.2, let go, and the sudden change in stress it created reached the next segment of the fault, which was already wound tight, already near its breaking point. 39 seconds later, that segment failed too, the 7.5. One quake didn't randomly happen near another. The first one may have pulled the trigger on the second. I say may have, and I want you to notice that I'm saying it carefully, because this is exactly the kind of moment where the honest answer and the viral answer split apart. The viral answer is certainty. The honest answer is that scientists are still measuring, still modeling the rupture, still arguing about how much of the second quake the first one caused. We're going to dig into that fight later, because it's the most important part of this whole story. But for now, hold on to the machine. 2 locked plates, decades of stored strain, a fault that breaks in segments, and a coastline of people living right on top of it. So the ground moved with the violence of an intensity 8.7. Now let's talk about what that does to a building, because this is where the physics turns into human consequences, and it's where the story stops being about geology and starts being about choices people made decades before the fault ever broke. When a strike-slip quake hits a city, the danger isn't the ground opening up and swallowing things. That's a movie image, and it almost never happens. The real danger is far more ordinary and far more deadly. It's the side-to-side shaking. The whole city gets whipped horizontally, back and forth, several times a second, and buildings, it turns out, are very good at holding themselves up against gravity, which pushes straight down. They are often terrible at resisting a force that shoves them sideways. There's a specific kind of building failure that shows up again and again in earthquakes like this one, and it has a name. It's called a soft story collapse. Picture a typical mid-rise apartment building, several floors of apartments stacked on top, solid walls, lots of structure. But the ground floor is different. The ground floor is open. It's a parking garage, or a row of shop fronts with big glass windows, or an open lobby on slender columns. There's far less wall down there to brace against sideways motion. So when the shaking comes, the heavy, rigid floors up top sway as one big mass, and all of that motion gets concentrated into the weak, open ground floor. The columns can't take it, they buckle, and the entire building above pancakes straight down onto that first level. The upper floors can survive almost intact, while the ground floor simply ceases to exist, crushed flat. It is one of the most lethal failure modes in all of earthquake engineering, and it is exactly the kind of failure that turns a survivable quake into a body count. Why am I telling you this in such detail? Because Venezuela has seen it before, in the very same region, and the lesson was written in blood almost 60 years ago. In 1967, a smaller quake, a magnitude in the mid-sixes, struck near Caracas. It was weaker than what hit on June 24th. And yet it brought down 4 multi-story apartment buildings and killed around 240 people. Those collapses became a global case study. Engineers around the world studied the Caracas buildings of 1967 to understand exactly how a moderate earthquake could fold modern concrete towers. The soft story problem was one of the answers. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The physics that crushed those buildings in 1967 didn't go away. The knowledge of how to fix it exists. We know how to brace a ground floor. We know how to retrofit, but retrofitting costs money, and it has to happen before the earthquake, in the quiet decades when the fault is silent and the danger feels imaginary. That's the hardest sell in all of disaster science. asking people to spend real money today to prevent a catastrophe that might not come for 50 years, or might come tomorrow night at 5 minutes past 10. So when buildings sway and crack and fall in a quake like this, it's tempting to call it an act of nature, pure and simple. But a lot of what determines who lives and who dies was decided long before the shaking started. It was decided in building codes, in budgets, in whether a city chose to reinforce its weakest structures or hope the fault would stay quiet. Nature provides the force. We decide how much of it reaches the people inside. Keep that idea close, because it's about to travel. This same fault story, the same locked plates, the same soft story risk, runs straight through one of the most famous and most feared faults on Earth. And it's not in Venezuela, it's in the United States. To understand how dangerous this fault system really is, we have to leave 2026 and travel back more than 200 years to a Holy Thursday in the spring of 1812. Because this is not the first time this corner of Venezuela has been torn apart. And the last time it happened on this scale, it didn't just kill people, it nearly changed the course of a nation's birth. It was March 26, 1812. Venezuela was in the middle of its war for independence from Spain. The country was raw, divided, fighting for its life. And in the late afternoon, the ground began to move. The estimates put it at a magnitude around 7.7, on the same network of faults, the San Sebastian and the Boconó, that feeds the system that broke this week. It struck Caracas. It struck Mérida. It flattened churches packed with worshippers for the Holy Week services. The death toll from that day is staggering, and I'm going to give it to you the way historians give it, with honesty about the uncertainty. The records from 2 centuries ago aren't precise, but the best historical reconstructions suggest that as many as 15,000 to 20,000 people died across the affected cities. In a country of barely 1 million at the time, that was a wound to the entire society. Whole congregations were buried where they knelt. The cathedral towers came down into the crowds below. And here's the part that turned a natural disaster into a turning point of history. The earthquake hit hardest in the cities controlled by the independence movement, the Patriots fighting Spain. The royalist-held regions were largely spared, and the Spanish authorities, and the church aligned with them, seized on that. They told the people that the earthquake was divine punishment, that God was angry at the rebellion, that the shaking was heaven's verdict against those who would defy the crown. It was, of course, nonsense. It was a fault doing what faults do, on a schedule set by the slow grind of tectonic plates that care nothing for politics or prayer. But in 1812, that explanation had power. The young revolutionary Simón Bolívar reportedly stood in the rubble and refused to accept the omen, declaring that if nature itself opposed them, they would fight nature and force it to obey. The quote has been polished by history, and I won't pretend I can give you his exact words. But the moment is real. A natural disaster nearly broke the will of a revolution, because people didn't understand what an earthquake was. Sit with that for a second, because it's the oldest version of the exact problem this channel exists to fight. When people don't understand the science, they fill the gap with a story. In 1812, the story was divine wrath. In 2026, as we'll see, the story is secret weapons and solar flares. The costume changes. The mistake is identical. A fault moves, people are afraid, and someone offers them a villain instead of an explanation. The fault that killed thousands in 1812 is the same family of faults that broke this week. It has been storing strain that entire time. More than 200 years of the Caribbean plate grinding west, 3/4 of an inch at a time. That's roughly 13 feet of accumulated motion the rock has been trying to release. The ghost of 1812 was never gone, it was just waiting, locked in the rock, for the friction to lose again. Now here's where this stops being a story about a foreign country. Because at almost the exact moment those quakes struck Venezuela, a warning went out across the Caribbean, and it reached American soil. The United States Tsunami Warning System issued a tsunami advisory, not just for Venezuela, for Puerto Rico, for the United States and British Virgin Islands, for the islands of Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire. For a few tense hours, the agencies whose job is to protect American coastlines were watching the water, because a shallow magnitude 7.5 right on a coast is exactly the kind of event that can shove the sea. Let that sink in. This was not a distant foreign tragedy, with no connection to you. Puerto Rico is home to roughly 3.2 million United States citizens, the Virgin Islands more than 100,000 more, and for those hours, they were inside the warning zone. People near the coast were told to be ready to move to higher ground, in the dark, on the word of instruments reading a fault 500 miles away. The advisory was later cancelled. No destructive wave materialized, and we're going to explain exactly why in the next chapter, because the reason is itself a crucial piece of science. But the warning was real, and the fear was real, and it landed on Americans. The Caribbean is not a faraway place that earthquakes happen to. It is ringed by United States territory and United States citizens, and it sits on one of the most under-discussed seismic boundaries in the hemisphere. And it goes deeper than just the people who felt the warning. Think about who lives in Florida. The Venezuelan American community in the United States numbers an estimated 600,000 people, and a huge share of them are clustered in South Florida, in the city of Doral, and across greater Miami-Dade County. For those families, this wasn't a news story from another continent. This was the city where their parents live. This was a frantic round of phone calls in the middle of the night, trying to find out if the people they love were standing in the street, watching their building sway. But here's the part that should matter to every single American watching this, even if you've never been to the Caribbean and don't know a soul in Venezuela. The fault that broke this week is a strike-slip fault on a major plate boundary, grinding sideways at a couple of centimeters a year. Does that description sound familiar? It should, because it is, almost word for word, the description of the San Andreas fault. The San Andreas is the same kind of beast, a right lateral strike-slip fault, marking the boundary between two great plates, the Pacific and the North American, sliding past each other at a comparable rate. The physics that wound up the Pilar fault and released it in two violent shocks is the same physics loading the San Andreas right now, under California, under millions of Americans, under cities full of the exact kind of buildings we talked about a moment ago. Venezuela this week is not just a tragedy to feel sorry about from a distance, it's a preview. It's the same machine, running the same process, on the same kind of fault, in another part of the world that just happened to reach its breaking point first. When you watch what happened to those Venezuelan cities, you are watching a rehearsal for a show that California has a ticket to. That's not fear-mongering, that's just the geology. The two faults are cousins, and one of them just reminded everyone what it can do. Now we get to the part of this story that almost no one in the news is covering. Everyone is showing you the cracked buildings in Caracas, the swaying high-rises, the people in the streets, the rubble. And that's real, and it matters. But the most dangerous thing about this earthquake might not be the shaking at all. It might be what's sitting on the ground directly above the rupture. And to understand it, we need to talk about a phenomenon with a strangely gentle name: liquefaction. Here's what liquefaction is. In a lot of coastal areas, the ground isn't solid rock. It's loose, sandy, waterlogged sediment. Picture the soil near a harbor, near a river mouth, near reclaimed land along a coast. The individual grains of sand are touching each other, holding the weight of everything above, with water filling the spaces in between. Normally it's stable enough to build on. Cities do it all the time. But shake that waterlogged sand hard enough, and something terrifying happens. The vibration jolts the sand grains loose from each other. For a few seconds they stop touching. The water pressure between them spikes, and the grains start floating in their own water. And in that moment, the solid ground you built a city on stops behaving like a solid at all. It behaves like a liquid. A heavy building can tilt, sink, even topple, not because it was crushed, but because the ground beneath it briefly turned to quicksand and then froze solid again once the shaking stopped, with the building now buried in it at an angle. Now here's why this specific earthquake worries the scientists who actually read the data. The USGS didn't just issue a red alert for shaking, it issued a separate red alert for ground failure, for liquefaction, and the model estimated that roughly 170,000 people live in the zone where that liquefaction risk is highest. 170,000. And look at what's in that zone. This stretch of the Venezuelan coast is home to Puerto Cabello, a city of around 200,000 people, and the largest container port in the entire country. And right there, in the same vulnerable coastal corridor, sits El Palito, one of Venezuela's major oil refineries. Refineries and ports are built on exactly the kind of flat, low-lying, water-saturated coastal ground that liquefies. They almost have to be. That's where the ships dock. So picture the second threat scenario the headlines are missing. It's not just apartment buildings shaking in Caracas. It's the possibility that the ground under a refinery's tank farm, under a major port's wharves and pipelines, briefly turns to liquid. Pipelines shear, tank foundations tilt, wharves slump into the harbour, a single failure mode that can take out fuel infrastructure and a shipping lifeline at the same time, in the same few seconds. And if you think that's exotic, it isn't, and Americans have seen it. In 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake struck the San Francisco Bay Area, and one of the hardest-hit neighborhoods was the Marina District in San Francisco, which was built partly on filled land, loose material dumped into the bay decades earlier. When the shaking came, that fill liquefied, buildings sank and tilted, gas mains ruptured, and fires broke out in a neighborhood where the ground had just turned to soup. The same physics, the same coastal fill, the same lesson, written into an American city 37 years ago. That's the threat that doesn't make the headline, because liquefaction doesn't photograph as dramatically as a collapsed tower. But it's the one the engineers are watching, because when the ground itself stops being ground, it doesn't matter how well you built what's on top of it. Let's go back to that tsunami advisory, the one that put Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands on alert, because the story of why the wave didn't come is just as important as the fear that it might. And it teaches you something most people get completely backwards about earthquakes and tsunamis. Here's the instinct most people have. Big earthquake near the ocean equals big tsunami. Simple. But it's wrong, and the reason it's wrong comes straight back to the kind of fault we've been talking about all night. A strike-slip fault. Remember what a strike-slip fault does. The two sides slide past each other, horizontally, sideways, side to side. And here's the thing about a tsunami. A tsunami is created when the ocean floor moves vertically, up or down. When a chunk of the seabed suddenly thrusts upward or drops down, it shoves the entire column of water above it, and that displaced water races outward as a wave. It's like pushing your hand up from the bottom of a full bathtub. The water has to go somewhere, so it surges. But a strike-slip fault mostly moves sideways. The two sides grind past each other horizontally, and horizontal motion doesn't lift the water column, it just slides under it. Imagine stirring a pot of water by moving a spoon flat across the bottom, sideways, without lifting it. You barely make a ripple. That's why the most violent strike-slip earthquakes, the ones that devastate cities on land, often produce little to no tsunami at all. The energy goes sideways, into the cities, not upward, into the sea. That's almost certainly why the advisory for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands was cancelled within hours. The warning centers issue the advisory first, fast, out of caution, because in the first minutes after a shallow coastal magnitude 7.5, you do not have time to wait and see. You warn, and then you measure. They watched the deep ocean sensors, the tide gauges and the pressure sensors on the seafloor that the system uses to confirm whether a wave has actually formed. And when the data came back showing no significant wave, they stood down the advisory. The system worked exactly as designed. Warn on the worst case, confirm with the instruments, cancel when the threat clears. But I want to be honest about the asterisk here, because this channel doesn't deal in false comfort. Strike-slip quakes rarely make big tsunamis. Rarely is not never. A strike-slip quake can still trigger an underwater landslide, a chunk of the seafloor breaking loose and sliding downhill, and that landslide can shove water and make a local wave even when the fault itself didn't lift the sea. It's happened. So the warning centers weren't being paranoid. They were respecting a real, if smaller, possibility. This time the ocean stayed quiet. The threat this time was never really the water. It was the land, and the cities, and the ground that holds them up. I want to slow down here, because it would be easy to keep this whole story in the language of magnitudes and fault mechanics, and stay comfortably distant from it. But there are people under every one of those data points, and I'm going to tell you about them honestly, which means I'm not going to invent anyone. No made-up survivor, no scripted quote, no character written to make you cry. just what the data actually tells us about who was in the path. Start with that liquefaction number again. 170,000 people live in the zone where the ground itself was most at risk of failing. That's not an abstraction. That's a number larger than the entire population of many American cities. 170,000 individuals who were, at 5 minutes past 10 at night, in their homes, in their beds, in the most ordinary moment imaginable, sitting on top of ground that the United States Geological Survey had flagged as likely to give way. Think about the city of Puerto Cabello itself, around 200,000 people, a working port city, the kind of place where a huge share of the population is tied, directly or indirectly, to the harbour and the refinery and the ships. These are dock workers, truck drivers, refinery technicians, the families who depend on those paychecks. When you hear critical infrastructure at risk, that's who that phrase is actually about. Not just pipelines and wharves, the people whose entire livelihood is welded to them. And then there's Caracas, more than 200 miles away, where buildings swayed hard enough to send residents pouring into the streets in the dark. We don't have to imagine what that fear feels like in that specific city, because the city remembers. That's the thing about Caracas. It has a memory. In 1967, the quake we talked about earlier brought down 4 apartment buildings and killed around 240 people. Those weren't anonymous statistics to the city. They were neighbors, whole families who went to bed in an 8-story building and were gone by morning because the ground floor failed and everything above it came down. The survivors of 1967, the people who lost family in those collapses, some of them are still alive. For them, the swaying on June 24th wasn't a new fear, it was an old one. Walking back through the door, it came in 59 years ago. This is what I mean when I say the truth doesn't need exaggeration. I don't need to put words in a survivor's mouth to make you feel the weight of it. The real numbers do the work. 170,000 people on failing ground. A city that has buried its neighbors before and knew, in the first seconds of shaking, exactly what that motion could mean. The honest version is heavier than any story I could make up. And there's a quieter human truth underneath all of it, one that connects every disaster this channel has ever covered. The people most at risk in an earthquake are almost never the ones who chose the risk. They didn't design the building code. They didn't decide whether the refinery sat on solid rock or coastal fill. They didn't set the budget for retrofitting. They just live there, in the homes they can afford, in the cities where their work is, doing the most human thing there is, which is getting on with an ordinary life on top of a fault they mostly try not to think about. The fault doesn't care about any of that. It moves on its own schedule, and the gap between what people deserve and what the geology delivers is the space where every one of these tragedies actually happens. Keep those 170,000 people in mind, because now we have to ask the question that should be keeping a different group of people awake. Not in Venezuela, in California. We keep coming back to California, and now it's time to make that connection concrete, because it is not a loose metaphor. The parallel between what happened in Venezuela and what is loaded and waiting under the Western United States is specific, and it is measurable, and it should change how you watch this story. Start with the fault itself. The El Pilar fault that broke this week is a right lateral strike-slip fault. The San Andreas is a right lateral strike-slip fault. Both sit on the boundary between 2 major tectonic plates. Both grind sideways at roughly a couple of centimeters a year. Both are locked along much of their length, storing strain in exactly the way we described with the bending ruler. When seismologists look at the Venezuela rupture, they are looking at a close mechanical cousin of the fault that runs the length of California, past Los Angeles, past the San Francisco Bay, under the homes of tens of millions of Americans. Now bring back the soft story buildings. Remember that lethal failure mode, where the open ground floor of a building, the parking garage or the row of shop fronts, can't resist the sideways shaking, and the whole structure pancakes down onto that weak first level. We saw why it mattered in Caracas in 1967. Here's why it should matter to you. California is full of these buildings. In the San Francisco Bay Area alone, surveys have identified on the order of 13,500 soft-story buildings, older, multi-unit residential structures with weak ground floors, the exact configuration that fails in a strike-slip earthquake. These aren't hypothetical. They're real apartment buildings full of real people, and many cities in the region have passed mandatory retrofit ordinances specifically to force owners to brace those ground floors before the next big one hits. The fact that those laws had to be written tells you the problem was, and in many places still is, widespread. The engineers know exactly which buildings are likely to fail. The race is whether the retrofits get finished before the fault does. And the doublet itself, the 2 quakes in 39 seconds, has an American echo too. In 2019, near the town of Ridgecrest in Southern California, a magnitude 6.4 earthquake struck. And then, about a day and a half later, a magnitude 7.1 struck on the same fault system, larger than the first. The first quake had loaded stress onto the neighboring fault and helped trigger the bigger one that followed. That's the same family of behavior we saw in Venezuela, just stretched over hours instead of seconds. California has already seen one earthquake set up another. It's not a foreign phenomenon. It's in the catalogue, with a United States zip code attached. So when I say Venezuela is a mirror, I mean it precisely. Same fault type, same trigger behavior, same vulnerable buildings. The only real differences are the names on the map and the fact that California has had more warning, more money, and more time to prepare. The question that should keep Californian emergency planners awake isn't whether their fault can do what Venezuela's just did, it's whether enough of those 13,000 buildings get fixed before they find out. There's one more place we have to go before we deal with the conspiracies, and it's the hardest one. Because to understand the worst-case version of what a shallow strike-slip earthquake can do to a vulnerable, unprepared region, you don't have to imagine it. You can look at January 12, 2010. You can look at Haiti. The Haiti earthquake was a magnitude 7.0. Notice that. 7.0. That's smaller than either of the shocks that hit Venezuela this week. It struck at a shallow depth, around 8 kilometers, just southwest of the capital, Port-au-Prince. And it struck on the Enriquillo Plantain Garden Fault, which is part of the very same Caribbean plate boundary system that runs east toward Venezuela. Same boundary, same kind of fault, same shallow sideways violence. A smaller magnitude, on the same plate edge, 1,500 kilometers to the west. And the death toll was almost beyond comprehension. Here I have to be honest with you about the numbers again, because they are genuinely disputed, and the dispute matters. The government of Haiti put the figure as high as around 316,000 dead. Some peer-reviewed studies that went back and tried to count more carefully came up with lower figures, in the range of 100,000 to 160,000. The truth is, we may never have an exact number, and I'm not going to pretend a single clean figure is settled when it isn't. But take even the lowest credible estimate, 100,000 people, from a magnitude 7.0, smaller than what Venezuela just survived. How? How does a 7.0 kill on that scale when far larger quakes elsewhere kill a fraction as many? And the answer is the entire point of this channel, so listen closely. It wasn't the magnitude, it was everything around the magnitude. It was shallow, so the energy hit the surface hard. It was right next to a dense capital city, and that city was built largely of unreinforced concrete and masonry, structures with no real defense against sideways shaking, in a place without the money, the building codes, or the enforcement to make them safe. The buildings did almost all of the killing, not the fault, the buildings. That's the lesson Haiti carved into the record, and it's the lesson hanging over Venezuela right now, and frankly over every vulnerable city on every fault on Earth. The magnitude is what nature decides. The death toll is what we decide in advance, through the boring, unglamorous, expensive work of building things that don't fall down. A magnitude 7.5 in a well-prepared city with strict codes and retrofitted buildings can pass with broken windows and rattled nerves. The same quake in an unprepared one can erase a generation. I'm not telling you this to frighten you about Venezuela's outcome, which, as we record this, is still being counted, and which we will not exaggerate. I'm telling you because it's the key that unlocks the whole story. The fear that the headlines sell you is the magnitude, the raw number, the 7.5, but the magnitude was never really the thing that determines whether people live or die. We are. Our codes, our budgets, our choices in the quiet decades. And anyone who tells you the danger comes from a secret machine or an angry sun is steering you away from the one variable that actually decides who survives, which is exactly where we're going next. So let's talk about the version of this story that's spreading online right now, because within hours of those two quakes, before the dust had even settled in Caracas, a different explanation was already racing across social media. Not plate tectonics, not a locked fault releasing 2 centuries of strain. No, according to this version, the doublet was triggered, on purpose, by a machine, or by the sun. You've seen the claims. The earthquake was caused by HAARP, the research facility in Alaska, or it was set off by a solar flare, the sun reaching across 93 million miles of space to crack a fault in Venezuela. And the proof, they'll tell you, is right there in the timing. 2 quakes, 39 seconds apart. That's too perfect, they say. Nature doesn't do that. Someone, or something, pushed a button. I want to take this seriously, not because it's true, but because dismantling it carefully is the most useful thing this whole video can do. So let's actually do the physics. Start with HAARP. HAARP is a real facility. It's a research array in Alaska that studies the ionosphere, the electrically charged upper layer of our atmosphere, by beaming radio energy up into it. That's real. Here's what's also real. The total power HAARP can transmit is around 3.6 megawatts. That sounds like a lot until you put it next to an earthquake. A magnitude 7.5 releases energy on the order of what you'd get from tens of millions of tons of explosive. The gap between what HAARP emits and what a major earthquake releases isn't large. It's astronomical. It's a difference of many, many orders of magnitude. Asking HAARP to trigger this quake is like asking a single household flashlight to heat the entire ocean. And there's a second, even more fundamental problem. HAARP's energy goes up. It beams radio waves into the ionosphere, around 60 miles above your head. Earthquakes happen down, miles below the surface, under solid rock. Radio energy aimed at the sky doesn't penetrate the crust. It physically can't reach the fault. It's pointed the wrong way, at a target made of the wrong stuff, with millions of times too little power. 3 independent reasons it cannot do what's claimed, and you only need one of them. Now the sun. The idea that a solar flare triggers earthquakes feels intuitive, because both are powerful and dramatic, so surely they're connected. But intuition isn't evidence, and scientists have actually checked this. Rigorously, researchers have taken decades of global earthquake records and decades of solar and geomagnetic activity records and lined them up, looking for any statistical fingerprint, any sign that earthquakes cluster around solar storms. One of the most cited studies, by Love and Thomas, published in a peer-reviewed geophysics journal, did exactly this analysis, and the result was clear. There is no statistically significant correlation between solar activity and global earthquake rates. None that holds up. The sun does many things to our planet. It can knock out power grids and disrupt satellites and paint the sky with auroras. Cracking faults is not on the list. But here's the detail the conspiracy version is leaning on hardest, and I want to confront it directly, because it's the most persuasive sounding part. On the very same day as the Venezuela doublet, other earthquakes happened around the world. There was a magnitude 5.6 in Northern California, near Redwood Valley. There was a strong quake off the coast of northern Japan. And to someone scrolling fast, that looks damning. Earthquakes everywhere, all at once. That can't be a coincidence. Except it almost certainly is. And to see why, you have to understand how often the Earth actually shakes. Here's a number that reframes everything. On any given day, the Earth produces dozens of earthquakes large enough to be widely felt, and hundreds more that are detectable. Magnitude 5 and up events happen, on average, more than once a day, every day, somewhere on the planet. The Earth is not quiet. It is constantly, restlessly moving. We just don't notice, because most of those quakes happen under the ocean or in places with no one around to feel them. So when you see a magnitude 5 in California and a strong quake off Japan on the same day as the Venezuela doublet, you're not seeing a coordinated global event. You're seeing a normal day on a seismically active planet, with one extraordinary event on it. The California quake and the Japan quake would have happened that day regardless of what Venezuela did. They're on completely different faults, on different plate boundaries, thousands of miles apart, with no physical mechanism connecting them. Grouping them together is a trick your pattern-seeking brain plays on you. It's the same instinct that finds faces in clouds. The pattern feels real. It isn't there. Now, I owe you a piece of honesty here, because this is where a cheap debunk would lie to you, and this channel won't. There is a real scientific phenomenon where one earthquake can influence another. It's called dynamic triggering. The seismic waves from a very large earthquake can travel across the planet and, in rare cases, nudge a fault on the far side that was already right at its breaking point. It's documented. It's real. So earthquakes are not always perfectly independent. But, and this is everything, dynamic triggering is a small, subtle effect, and it works through ordinary seismic waves traveling through the Earth, not through secret machines or solar rays. It mostly matters over short distances and short times, which is exactly why the doublet itself, two ruptures 39 seconds apart on the same connected fault system, is a textbook example of real triggering, while a quake in California on the same day is not. The honest science actually explains the 39 seconds beautifully. The first rupture changed the stress on the adjacent segment and helped push it over the edge. That's the trigger. It was the fault triggering itself, through known physics, in real time. Not Alaska, not the sun. And here's the thing I most want you to take from all of this. The conspiracy version, the secret weapon, the angry sun, it actually offers a strange kind of comfort. Because if a machine did this, then someone is in control. Someone has a hand on the lever. The world is being managed, even if by villains. That's almost reassuring. The real version is far more unsettling. No one is in control. There is no button, no operator, no plan. There is only a planet whose crust is broken into enormous plates, grinding past each other on a schedule set by physics, storing strain for centuries and releasing it without warning, without intent, without anyone's permission. The fault under Venezuela didn't get activated. It just ran out of friction the way it always eventually does, the way the San Andreas eventually will. That's the truth the conspiracy is hiding from you. Not a secret weapon, the far scarier fact that nobody is steering this at all. So where does that leave us? The night after the ground broke twice in 39 seconds. It leaves us with a fault that is still moving, because an earthquake of this size doesn't just happen and stop, it echoes. In the hours and days after a magnitude 7.5, the same fault system produces aftershocks, smaller ruptures as the rock settles into its new position. Some of them are strong enough to bring down buildings already weakened by the main shock. This is why emergency crews move so carefully in the days after a major quake, and why the people who study these faults don't relax when the shaking stops. They get to work. They watch the aftershock sequence, they map exactly which segments slipped, and they ask the question that matters most. Did this rupture relieve the strain on the rest of the fault, or did it just load up the next segment that hasn't broken yet? That's not a question I can answer for you tonight, because the scientists are still answering it themselves, in real time, with the data still coming in. And that's exactly the point of this channel. We don't hand you a fake certainty. We hand you the real question and the real tools to think about it. So let's go back to where we started. 39 seconds, 2 hammer blows, and the question I asked you to hold on to. Did the first quake cause the second? After everything we've walked through tonight, you now know the honest answer. Probably, yes, in part. The first rupture changed the stress on the neighboring segment and likely helped trigger it through real, understood physics. Not a coincidence, not a conspiracy. A fault, talking to itself in a language of stress and strain that we are only just learning to read. And here's the takeaway I want to leave you with, the practical one. If you live on a fault, and far more of you do than realize it, the lesson of Venezuela isn't to be afraid of the sun or some facility in Alaska. It's to look at the building you're sitting in, to know whether your city has retrofitted its weakest structures, to have a plan for the 90 seconds when the ground decides to move. The danger was never the thing in the sky, it was always the thing under your feet and the choices we make before it wakes up. The fault under Venezuela is quieter now than it was on the night of June 24th. But quieter is not the same as finished. Somewhere along that plate boundary, and along the San Andreas, and along 100 other faults you've never heard of, the rock is still bending, still storing strain, still winding the spring for a release that could come in 50 years or 50 seconds. We don't get to know which. We only get to be ready. If this changed the way you think about the ground under your feet, then there's one more question you need to sit with. Because while everyone was watching Venezuela this week, another fault, one that sits directly under a major American city, crossed a threshold that has seismologists genuinely worried, and almost no one reported it. That's the story we're telling next, and you're going to want to see it before the headlines catch up. It's on the screen now. We'll see you there.